yet, so everyone was still chatting. As Craig sat down, he looked around the room, then I felt his stare shift to me. I turned and we made eye contact, and he nodded his head and said, "What's up?" I said, "Hey man, what's up?" He introduced himself, so I gave him my name as well. Craig was a white kid with very patchy, pubish-looking facial hair. He wasn't attractive, but he wasn't butt ugly. He just looked like a somewhat average guy. He was making small talk with me, and I was being nice because I could imagine how rough the first day at a new high school could be. I was probably the first person he officially met in the school. That period, we had to get into pairs for an assignment, so obviously Craig asked me to work with him. I had to say yes, why not? I didn't have any close friends in this class anyway. We had the laptop cart this period to begin work on the assignment, so we all had laptops. I could tell pretty quickly I didn't like Craig's sense of humor. He joked too much and was acting like we were good friends, but his jokes weren't normal, and he'd have this cringy laugh every time he made a joke. He cursed every other word, and he'd make constant dirty and vulgar jokes. I was no softie when it came to that, but it was just too much with him. By the end of the period, we had to exchange numbers for the project. Then it was on to my next class. Eventually came lunchtime. Mike didn't come to school for that day, so it was only Liam and I at our little circular lunch table. Suddenly I see Liam's eyes look up at someone behind me. Then someone pulls up a chair next to me, and I look and see Craig. He pats my shoulder and says, "What's up, buddy?" I kind of died a little inside. This meant he'd be sitting here every day now. I tried to be positive and give him a chance. Maybe he wasn't that bad. Liam tried being nice at first, but eventually, Craig started saying weird shit again, and Liam caught on that something was off, and he kept shooting me these knowing faces when Craig wasn't looking. That lunch period cemented the fact that something was off about Craig. I'm not judging anyone for being antisocial, but something about him seemed dark, like the awful things he'd say. It went beyond an antisocial personality. After school that day, since it was a Friday, I walked home and started texting my group chat about what we'd be doing later. On my walk home, I got a text from an unsaved number, and when I opened it, I realized it was Craig. He said, "Turn around." I did, and saw Craig running down the sidewalk towards me, waving. "Oh God," I said under my breath. I waited for him. When he caught up to me, he asked how far I lived from school. I said about a 10-minute walk, and he said same, and he said he'd walk with me. Then he asked if I wanted to work on the assignment real quick and bang it out over some beers. I told him I was actually going to be busy with my friends. He asked what I'd be doing. Uh-oh, he was trying to invite himself. I said we'd just be chilling at Liam's house, and he actually asked if it was cool he came. I didn't even know what to say. I came up with some BS, like Liam's mom doesn't let strangers in right away. It seemed to work. Craig kept walking with me, and I started wondering, is he following me all the way home? That's what he did. I got to my house and said, "Alright man, see you later," and gave him a little fist bump. He said, "See you later," and kept walking down the street. I noticed him look back, so I looked away. I texted my group chat about how weird he is, and Liam backed up what I was saying. We went about making plans to hang out at Liam's house for real, but not until like 9 o'clock. After an hour or two later, Craig texted me something disturbing. He said, "Yo, what's going on in front of your house? Why is there a cop car?" I replied, "What do you mean?" I rushed to go outside to the front stoop. There were no cop cars. It was just Craig standing in our driveway. He was laughing, and like a complete weirdo, he laughed and said, "I got you." Then he said, "I thought you were going to your friend Liam's place." I said, "Yeah, in a little bit." Then I said, "Why are you being weird?" He didn't laugh at that. I saw he was visibly offended. I said I gotta go inside, and so I did and shut the door. He texted me all offended saying, "Bro, WTF." I was speechless. I just met this kid today. I spent 40 minutes with him. Why was he obsessing over me and following me and now stalking me? He literally tricked me into coming outside to see if I was home. I texted him back, "You're freaking me out, bro." I guess that was a mistake. He sent me some long message about how he thought I seemed chill and was different from the rest, but how I'm just like everyone else. I sent a screenshot to my friend group, and they were all laughing and shocked at the same time. I emailed my teacher and asked him if I could do the assignment myself and explain the situation. Then I left my house and walked to Liam's house just to get out. While I was at Liam's, Craig tried calling me. I just let it ring and ignored it. It was going to be an awkward day of class come Monday morning. Skipping ahead to when I got home around 11 or 12, my parents and sister were out. My parents might have been out with friends, and my sister may have been with her boyfriend, nothing unusual. I locked the door behind me and went up to my room. I started watching YouTube videos. I heard the back door ring. Yes, our house has a back doorbell. It had a different ring than the front doorbell. I hopped up and went downstairs, expecting to see my sister at the back door. But the lights in the backyard were off, and no one was on the other side of the door. I could see through the glass. I opened the main door, with the screen door still locked. I said hello, and I 100% heard the sound of someone's shoe scraping the concrete patio, just to the left, out of view from the door. I shut the door again and relocked it, and went back upstairs to call my dad, who didn't pick up. But just then, my phone started ringing again. It was Craig. I didn't pick up. He then texted me saying, "Come outside, shitbag." I replied, "I'm calling the police." And to my surprise, he replied, okay, I'm leaving." It was him. He was hiding in the yard, waiting for me to come out. I sent the screenshot to my family and friends, and then to the school, who would reach out to his parents. Apparently, this was the exact reason the troubled family had to keep moving, because he would keep causing issues with people at every school he went to. I can only imagine the horrible things he's done to other people who didn't want to be his friend. He didn't show up to class on Monday, or ever again. If I had to guess, I think he once again transferred schools. I live in rural New Brunswick. It was early September and it was my first day of school. I unfortunately was held back my senior year, so I'd be returning as a 19-year-old. I live in a rural area, so the middle school and high school was the same building, which also meant I knew most of the kids since it was a smaller school. When I got to school, I had study hall period A, which was the first period of the day. However, I noticed a new kid that I never met before on the other side of the room. I walked over to him and introduced myself. He introduced himself to me as Chester, and that he just moved here. I showed him around the school and showed him where his next class is. As I was giving him a tour of the school, I noticed he seemed a bit off. As I was showing him around, he began to ask me questions. At first they seemed normal, like how long I've been at the school or where our classroom was, but then he asked me some questions that seemed more strange. One question he asked stood out the most. He asked for my address and snap. I was completely thrown off by this because I found it off to ask that. I ended up not giving him my address, but I thought why not to give him my snap. I gave him it and went on with my day. When the last period of the day came, I had English class. When I got to it, I noticed that there were only about 9 kids in the class. I was in the lowest level English class, so I wasn't expecting a lot of kids to be in my class.
Sherry?
I took my seat, and that's when I looked 120 degrees behind me and saw that Chester kid eating a disgusting sandwich. He stared at me from the opposite side of the room and gestured for me to walk over to him. My English teacher, Mr. Bass, was about to start class, so I ignored his bullshit and went on with the class. 5 minutes later, I looked up from my book, and I noticed Chester again staring at me. This time he was more pissed off looking. Again, he gestured for me to walk over to him, and again, I continued reading my book. Then my phone pinged. It was a Snapchat message from Chester. He said, "Follow me." I replied, "I can't, we're in the middle of class." Next, I saw him get up from his table and ask Mr. Bass if he could go to the bathroom. He then walked out into the hall. I wanted to see why he wanted me to follow him, so 5 minutes later, I asked Mr. Bass if I could go to the bathroom as well. I then walked out into the hall. I didn't know where he went, so I looked down each hallway, and eventually I saw him. He was walking really slowly about 50 feet away. I stayed at a distance behind him so that he wouldn't know I was there. He then turned down a hallway in the school that wasn't really used for classes, and was more for storage, bathrooms, and offices. I then saw him open a door. He walked inside and shut the door behind him. I walked over to the door he walked in and recognized it to be the door that led to the school's basement. There was no way in hell I was going down there. I just casually went back to my class. When I got back, my phone pinged. It was him again. First he sent me a message saying, "Why didn't you enter the basement?" He then sent a picture of him eating a disgusting sandwich in the basement. He sent one more chat asking me to walk down into the basement. By now I was getting creeped out by the kid, so I replied asking him to leave me alone. I then removed and blocked him. When I got home, I immediately started on my homework. By the time I was done, it was about 11 p.m. and I was home alone. I was putting all of my homework away. Just then, my phone received a notification from Snapchat. Someone added me as a friend. It was from an account called "Why Didn't You Enter the Basement?" It was him, so I blocked it. Then a couple minutes later, I got another request. This time the account was called "Why'd You Block Me?" I blocked that one, and then another one came. This one was even more ominous. It was called "I Know Where You Live," followed by "I'm right outside your house." And just then, I heard a window break downstairs. I immediately called the cops and told them what was happening, and the operator said find a safe place to hide and lock the door. I then hung up and went into the hallway closet. I heard footsteps move from downstairs to upstairs. I cracked open the closet door and I saw him. At the end of the hallway in the dark, I saw Chester. It didn't seem like he knew that I noticed him until he turned his head to look at the closet, but it didn't seem like he knew I was inside. I didn't close the door, but I hid deeper in the closet. Chester then went over and opened the door. I was hiding behind a large container while he struggled to find the light. He eventually gave up and I heard his footsteps fade away downstairs. Seconds later, the police knocked on the door. I immediately opened it and told them what happened, but by the time they arrived, Chester was gone, and there was nobody on my property. They found out that he escaped through a window in my basement. I gave the police the accounts, and they said they'll do their best to trace them. The very next day of school, I went to the principal to report Chester, but the creepiest thing was what he told me. My principal said that there was nobody in the whole school named Chester. There were no records of him ever having been a student. I got chills. The camera footage was checked, and it turned out that he snuck in through a back entrance of the school and blended in with the other kids. I never saw him again at school, and I never heard from the police. But to this day, I still think about why he wanted me to go into the school basement. All I can say is that was probably the most dangerous person I'd ever met, and I don't know what his intentions were. I've worked as a nurse in multiple hospitals and facilities. Before the current hospital I work at, I worked at a geriatric hospital 30 minutes from my house. I had experience working with older patients before, so this was nothing new to me. I had been working at this hospital for only a couple of weeks, and you'll soon understand why. This was on my second to last shift at this hospital, unbeknownst to me at the start of that night. I was working the graveyard shift, and I was running on negative hours of sleep. I was assigned to the Alzheimer's ward. The patients in this ward absolutely adored me. My presence as a young girl in her 20s among the residents of this ward who were otherwise left to themselves to float around in their minds, I'm sure saw me as a breath of fresh air. Someone who could tie them to the now or to the everyday. If you're just left to yourself, you can mentally go to other places, but with someone else in your space, you're tied to that moment in time. I was dealing with a number of patients that night, but one was a little more restless than the others. Her name was Lena. This was my first night dealing with her. She kept telling me anytime I'd enter her room about the voices she kept hearing, and the man dressed in black she kept seeing in the corner of the room. The other lady in the room requested her curtain be closed before my shift started so that Lena would leave her alone. She was a sweet lady that smiled whenever I was around her, but she didn't say much and was very forgetful. Since I started my shift around 9 p.m., most of the patients were asleep by 11.
Son of a
But
bitch.
not Lena. Whenever she called me into the room, she'd be frightened of these alleged voices she was hearing, and the man in black that kept staring at her in the corner of the room. Not gonna lie, it was creeping me out a little. I believed that in her mind she was seeing and hearing these things, and I sympathized with her because I imagined them to be very scary. But still, I tried my best to calm her down and get her to go to sleep. I didn't want to turn on the TV to calm her down because I wanted to be courteous of the other patient in the room. I held Lena's hands and told her it's okay, to breathe and to relax. I reminded her that she wasn't here alone, and I was always just a call away. This seemed to do the trick. Lena relaxed for a while, and the next time I came in the room, she was asleep. Once most, if not all, of the patients are asleep, the night goes much slower. Time almost moves in reverse. An hour or two later, I was in the linen room stocking my cart when I heard something in the room. It was a relatively small, dead quiet room. I had the door closed too. That's why hearing another noise was weird.
Sherry!
I turned, saw nothing, and resumed stocking my cart. Then I felt what I can only describe to be a hand on my shoulder. I looked at my shoulder, jumped, and screamed. but there was nothing on my shoulder.
You didn't
There was
answer
no
your
one in the
phone,
room.
so
Yet
Sherry,
I knew I felt something
don't
large
have time
basically
for
grab
this.
my shoulder. I went out in the hall for a second to peek my head. No other nurses in sight. Dead quiet.
Oh no.
I
Sherry!
had nothing else to do
Sherry,
but
I'm
resume what
coming.
I was doing. I continued stocking the
Hold
cart
on,
until
Sherry.
it was full.
I'll be right
then I
there.
turned to face the door. And I fell to the floor and started screaming as my heart was immediately in my throat. There was a man dressed in black standing outside the door, looking through the glass, smiling. My screams were loud enough to wake the entire ward. The man disappeared out of sight through the glass window of the door. Seconds later, the door opened and one of my fellow nurses came in to help me off the floor as I was hysterical. I asked her if she saw the man dressed in black. Her response was, "What man? There's no one else here." We checked all the rooms in the ward. There wasn't anybody dressed in black in there. My screams woke Lena from whatever light sleep she must have been in, and when I came into her room, she started talking of the voices. This time the screams, which she didn't know were my screams. I asked her what this man in black looked like, if he was smiling, and she looked at me, and I noticed her eyebrows point down, as her expression changed to look the most focused I'd seen her the entire day. She asked, "How did you know?" And even with my heart still racing, I felt it skip a beat as she said this. She started screaming now, screaming, "Get me out of here, he's coming." The other nurses came in and tried to calm her down. I was switched to a different ward that night with someone else, and I eventually ended up going home early because I was just so freaked out. I texted the head nurse the next day that my next shift would be my last, that the experience traumatized me, and that I didn't really want to be in that building anymore. I got as friendly of a response as I could have hoped for. I've never been diagnosed with anything, nor have I ever dealt with hallucinations of any kind. I'm aware of the effects of lack of sleep, but this was next level. I don't know if my mind started playing tricks on me from what Lena was telling me all night. The feeling of the hand on my shoulder, the image of the smiling man behind the glass door, matching the description a patient kept giving multiple times. This was one of those once-in-a-lifetime, unexplainable supernatural occurrences. At least, I hope it was once in a lifetime. Before the next story, I want to thank Guardio for sponsoring this video. Stories like the ones you hear on this channel are the reason why you need to be vigilant of your surroundings. But many people spend the majority of their time on the internet, so it's also important to be vigilant regarding your safety browsing the web. Guardio is an easy-to-use browser extension that, simply put, keeps you safe from scams and identity theft, so that you can do what you do online without worrying. By using Guardio, you'll protect your online browsing and information, avoid installing malware and falling victim to scams, and you'll get real-time alerts on any device when your information could be at risk. Everybody's encountered dangerous and annoying pop-ups while browsing the web. Guardio will immediately block any sites and providers that send you malvertising pop-ups so you can browse in peace. Being a YouTuber means hours of work online, so I wasn't too surprised when Guardio showed me all the existing threats on my system. Right now, Guardio is offering a special deal for my viewers. 20% off the monthly subscription if you use my link. So if you want a clean and secure browsing experience, go to guard.io/MrNightmare, link in the description, and check out their affordable premium plan for full protection. Three years ago, I contracted bacterial meningitis. I live in South Florida. I don't believe there was an outbreak going on or anything, so I'm not sure how I caught it or who I could have caught it from. I started developing really bad symptoms: painful headaches, confusion, sleepiness, nausea, and lack of appetite. But when the hallucinations started, that's when I knew I had something really serious. Laying sick in bed while my husband was at work, I heard a child's voice call Mom from downstairs. We don't have any kids. I dragged myself out of bed to look down the stairway to call my husband's name. Of course, he didn't answer because he was at work. The headache I had from standing was too much, so I went back to bed. For a second time, I heard a voice call from downstairs. It said hello. I picked up the phone and called my husband, freaking out to him into the phone that I was hearing a scary child's voice from inside the house, and that I thought I was hallucinating. He heard how distressed I was over the phone, and so he left work early to bring me to the hospital. While waiting for him to get home, I changed out of my pajamas, and while doing so, I had to run to the bathroom to throw up. As I was mid-throwing up, I heard another voice from outside of the bathroom. I couldn't hear what it might have said, nor could I tell if it sounded the same as the other voice I heard. I was losing my mind.
I wasn't diagnosed until I arrived at the hospital, and apparently, if untreated, what I had could be very serious, even fatal. The doctor told me the hallucinations part was rather unusual, but not unheard of. I was given antibiotics through a needle shortly after I arrived at the hospital with my husband. The doctor told me that I was fortunate to have come to the hospital so quickly, as if I had waited much longer, this could have had lasting effects or possibly have been fatal. My husband stayed with me for a few hours in the room. I was told I was going to have to stay there for a few days to a week, given the severity of my symptoms. Around 10 o'clock, my husband left to go home, as he had work the next day. The nurse told me call her if I should have any issues. Though I still felt like absolute death, I nodded off pretty quickly. I started having this dream where my ex-husband was in the room, over my bed, looking down at me, talking. He was saying horrible things about my current husband. He patted my head and said he was glad I was okay, and that he came as soon as he saw my husband left. He went into this rant about how he despises my current husband and wants to kill him. He kept rubbing my forehead, then left the room. I often have bad dreams about my ex-husband because of how toxic and abusive our marriage was, and why it ended, which I'd rather not include. I woke up in this drowsy, lightheaded state and looked around the room. There was a chair pulled up in front of my hospital bed, but no one was sitting in it. It wasn't like that when my husband left. It was still the middle of the night, so I went back to sleep. I woke up the next morning to the nurse in the room. I told her about the weirdly vivid dream I had, and she laughed and told me that wasn't a dream, that my cousin came to visit me last night. I told her I don't have any cousins that live in this state. She looked more serious now and said, "Well, someone who said they're your cousin David visited you late last night." David was the name of my ex-husband. After explaining better, the nurse got a doctor, and the doctor told me the antibiotics may have caused delirium, which hindered my ability to recognize sleep from wakefulness, hence why I was so vividly hearing what David was saying. I called my husband to tell him what happened, and of course he was livid and concerned. He came back again that night after work. But that day, I texted David, asking what the hell he was thinking visiting me. How did he know I was in the hospital? My text delivered, but he ignored it. I sent a follow-up, telling him I heard all this threats towards my husband and that I'd be getting police involved. And minutes later, he responded saying, "I never made any threats towards your husband. I was simply there when I heard what happened to make sure you were okay. You must have heard things in your sleep." I responded, "Stay out of my life or I'll get police involved again." He didn't respond after this. I never told my husband about the threats I heard in my drowsy half-asleep state, because I didn't know if they were real or not. With a mix of the antibiotics and my already having weird audible hallucinations the day before, I don't think it's impossible that what I heard wasn't actually what was said. But I could be wrong. I left the hospital the next week. I once matched this girl that I'm still friends with on Tinder, named Francesca. She seemed cool right from the bat. She had a sleeve of tattoos on her left arm, red highlights in her hair, and she had in her profile that she loved to work out. One of her pictures was taken on the rooftop of this cool-looking building with a sick view. I asked her where it was, and she told me it was some abandoned hospital on the edge of town that's super cool to explore at night, and super easy to get into. There's usually one cop patrolling the huge parking lot at night to deter trespassers. But she said it was super easy to circumvent. She came up with the idea of us going there together as our first date of sorts, if you want to use the word date. I was totally on board with it. She seemed cool, and it seemed like a cool, different kind of way to meet someone as opposed to the usual let's get drinks. I picked her up from her house 10 minutes away. Then we drove the 20 minutes to get to the hospital. I was driving home from work one night, taking my usual route home. I got out at midnight, so it was probably 12:15ish at this point. My town is pretty quiet and boring. A lot of woods everywhere, and not a lot of people or houses. I was on this road not far from my house with a cornfield on one side and a patch of woods on the other. It was midsummer and like 75 degrees, so I had my convertible top down. I was cruising down the street going like 50 when I heard a loud, blood-curdling woman's scream come from one side of the road, but I couldn't tell which one. I brought the car to a quick halt by slamming on the brakes and listening. There was a woman's cry from the left side, in the woods. She was crying for help. I got out of my car and grabbed the baton from my back seat. I walked towards the woods and called back, "Who's out there?" and the woman immediately called back, "Please help me." I began to run into the woods, swiping all the twigs and bushes out of my way. I yelled out to the woman to keep screaming so I could find her. She'd every 10 seconds or so scream help, and I'd approach in that direction, running, screaming back. But pretty soon, I started to realize no matter how far into the woods I went, the woman's yells didn't seem to get any closer or louder. If anything, they were always the same distance, even though I was booking it straight in the direction of the screams. I screamed out, "Tell me where you are," and about 5 seconds later, the woman once again screamed out, "Help." I stopped in my tracks now. I didn't like this. I started to feel like I was walking into some kind of trap. I turned around and started running back in the direction I came. I ran and ran until I could see the flashing headlights of my car on the side of the road beyond the trees. The whole way back, I still heard the woman's screams, but they were still the same distance no matter how much closer to my car I got, as if she were following me back. Was I being stalked? I got in my car and just drove out of there, completely freaked out. I called 911 to report it to the authorities in case they'd want to investigate it. I wasn't sticking around there though, I was tired. After telling a few friends and family about the strange encounter, I was ready to move on with my life. But a week later, I saw something on the news that made me sick to my stomach. The dead body of a 30-something-year-old woman was found in the woods by a man hiking with his dog. Oddly, there were no signs of foul play. The location that the body was reported to have been found was the same general area where I heard the screams. While that patch of woods is very big, I can't help but feel that would be a huge coincidence. I was driving from Brooklyn to Vermont to my friend John's cabin to have a weekend of snowboarding. I had 2 cars at the time of this story, a 2013 BMW 3 Series and a 2006 Ford F-150, which I was driving on this particular night. I had my snowboarding gear in the bed of the truck. I was about 45 minutes from my buddy's cabin at this point. It was late, like 10 p.m. It was pitch black on these roads and it was snowing. There were like no other cars on the road up there besides me at that hour. I had just gotten my truck back from the mechanic a few weeks ago. I frequently had problems with that truck, and that night was no exception. At perhaps the worst possible time, on the quietest, darkest road, suddenly my engine starts to completely overheat into the red zone. I slow down and pull onto the side, and I wait for it to cool down again. Then I slowly got back on the road. But even at a slow speed, the needle went back up to the red, and the engine was overheating again. I had to pull over and turn off the truck. I went under the hood to try and diagnose the problem, but I couldn't in the dark and the snow. I had to call John. On this road, the reception for T-Mobile was non-existent. I couldn't even call for help. In the moment, I felt screwed. I went into the truck to turn it on again, and at least wait in the heat of the truck as it idled. It didn't seem to overheat while idling. I tried one more time to drive, but the same thing happened again. So I had to wait like 10 minutes before I saw a car passing. I had my hazards on, and I opened the door and waved my arms. The passing car stopped. It was some little Toyota. The guy rolled his window down, and I thanked him for stopping and asked if I could use his phone. He asked what happened. I told him my truck was overheating and was undrivable. He then asked me if I'm all alone. I paused for a second and said, "Yeah?" He reached for his cell phone and handed it to me. He must have been a local because he had bars. I called my friend John, he picked up, and I asked him what I should do. He told me to call this specific towing company nearby and that he'd come and pick me up. I gave him my exact location, and he said he was gonna head over. After that, I called the towing company he gave me and requested assistance. During both phone calls, the guy in his car watched me the whole time. I tried to not look back though. After my phone calls, I handed the man back his phone and thanked him. He said you're welcome, and without saying anything else, he rolled up his window and drove down the snowy road into the darkness ahead. I watched as his taillights disappeared completely as he descended below the top of the hilly road above. I was once again alone. I got back into my idling truck to be in the warmth. I flicked the headlights off for a second just to get an idea of how dark it was out. And when I say I couldn't see an inch outside the windows, I'm not exaggerating. It was pure blackness. I sat in the truck waiting and waiting. I couldn't even do anything that needed an internet connection. I resorted to playing games on my phone for 20 minutes, until there was a bang at my passenger side window. I jumped out of my skin as I looked to the window. I couldn't see much of the person, it was too dark outside, and the headlights didn't really light up the sides of the truck. I heard a man's voice start begging for help. He was yelling at me to open the door, he was freezing. I heard him trying to open the door himself, but it was locked. I shined my flashlight to the window, but it barely helped in seeing who was out there. All I saw was someone in a really big black coat with the hood over his head. I yelled back, "What's wrong?" And the mysterious man outside replied saying he's lost and stranded and needs to get out of the cold. I didn't trust this. I sat there nervously trying to figure out what to ask him to prove he's not someone looking to harm me. I didn't even figure out what to say before he started aggressively trying to still open the locked door, and then started pounding on the glass even harder, still screaming for help. In the heat of the moment, I decided to listen to my gut. I put the truck in drive, and he realized this and started pounding harder on the window to break it. I drove the truck onto the road and brought it up to 30 miles per hour, despite the damage I was surely doing to the overheating engine. But then I saw something that I didn't expect that made me feel like my heart skipped a beat. As I came over the hill in the road, I noticed the reflection of taillights approaching me on the side of the road. As I passed the parked car, I realized it was that same Toyota from earlier, the one that the man was driving. I slowed down and lowered the window to see if the man was in the car, but I didn't see anything. It seemed like the car was empty. I looked out the window for a second behind the car, and my taillights lit up footprints in the snow, meaning that man who was banging on my window was him, and he was trying to trick me into opening the door to do who knows what. I kept driving my truck, knowing full well I was fucking up the engine, but I didn't care at that point. I pulled over a few minutes later when I saw headlights approaching on the other side, and I wanted to cheer in excitement when I realized it was the tow truck. I flashed my lights and he pulled to the side. As the driver came out, I told him about what just happened. He joked that he got there at the right time. Then he asked if the guy had a gun or anything on him, but I told him I couldn't see. He replied, "Well, then we better do this quick." It took him about 15 minutes to get the truck attached, and in that time, the Toyota never passed us. It was possible he turned around and went the other way for this exact reason. I used the tow truck driver's phone to call John again and tell him to just meet us at the body shop. To summarize the rest, John and I still went snowboarding that weekend, and the body shop replaced the broken water pump in my truck, causing the overheating. I sold that truck a few weeks later. I'm glad I didn't lower my window or unlock the doors to that man trying to get into my car. In that setting, I could have been murdered, and no one would have ever known who had done it. I had my first girlfriend at 17. I lived with my mom at the time because my parents got a divorce when I was 11. One day, I asked my girlfriend on a date, and she was down. We both had jobs. I worked at a local grocery store and she worked at a Starbucks. We both worked the day shifts, and we were also in our senior year of high school. The reason why I asked her on a date that day was because it was a Friday, and we barely had any homework. After work, I picked up my girlfriend from her house. We went to a small restaurant 10 minutes away from my house, because that's all I could afford at the time. We ate, then we went back to her house to spend some time together. By then, it was dark. She complained how our date night was short, and I told her I can't take her anywhere else that had to be paid for. We came to an agreement that we would go on a night drive. We drove in town, then we drove on some empty road in the woods. Eventually the pavement ended and we were on a dirt road. I had to pee really bad. I told my girlfriend, and she had to pee as well. We pulled over and got out of my car. For some reason, right when we got out of the car, we smelt an awful, indescribable smell. I excused it as another person who also pulled over to do their business. My girlfriend actually gagged from the smell. I told her that we would pee real quick, then go back in the car to get back into town. There was a little flat area that was the best place to piss at. We did our thing, and then we were on our way back to my car. But on our way back, we heard a noise come from the left side of us. It sounded like a twig snapping. I was afraid it was an animal, so we rushed back to my car. Before I had time to open my car door, I heard a scream of fear or pain in the direction my girlfriend and I just pissed at. I told my girlfriend to get in my car while I go investigate. She begged me not to, but I did it anyway. To make her feel safer, I locked the doors. I went the direction to where we were, and I heard that scream again. For some reason, I lost all of my courage to investigate now that I heard it much closer. But when I heard it, it sounded like from the same direction that my girlfriend and I heard the twig snapping. Instead of going that way, I went on my phone, turned the flash on, then took a picture. Once the flash, I had the courage to invest to where we were anyway. To make her feel safer, it's a flat area that was the net. Before I had time to open my car door, I heard a scream of fear or pain in the direction my girlfriend and I just pissed at. I told my girlfriend to get in my car while I back to my car. It sounded like a twig snapping. I was afraid the door much closer. But instead of going that way, I went on my phone, turned the flash on, then took a picture. Once the flash went off, I saw a man in a white shirt with black stripes, with some blue tarp right in front of him. He was just standing there. I didn't hesitate to dash to the car. I unlocked the doors, got in my car, put it in drive, and floored it. My girlfriend kept asking me what happened. She saw I was scared. I told her I would explain later. We got back to the shadier side of town and drove back to my girlfriend's house. We entered the house and went into her room. That's when I told her I saw the man with the blue tarp in front of him, just standing there. I showed her the picture, and she was just as creeped out as I was. She let me spend the night because we were creeped out, and it was a Friday, and we also had no work or school the next day. That was by far the scariest moment of my life. We aren't in a relationship anymore. I'm 23, and she's 22, but we remain as best friends. It was late summer of 2011. I was almost 19 and was hanging out with my best friend who was a few years younger than me. We live in a very rural area of southwestern Virginia, about 15 minutes from Mount Airy, North Carolina. Around here, pretty much everything closes by 10 p.m., so you have to find your own ways to pass the time. But that was never a problem for us, as we could always find a way to have fun. The night started out harmless enough. First to the mall, then cruising the streets looking for girls, things any teen guys would be up to. When that proved to be unsuccessful, we just decided to go bowling until they closed. We then went to Main Street a little before daylight, just to walk some of the back alleys, acting like the edgy badasses we were. But we never felt like we were in any danger, as there isn't much violent crime in the area. After we'd walked all the streets, we got bored with this and decided to grab a bite from Waffle House, as this was pretty much the only late-night dining option. After we ate and made a quick stop at Walmart, we still weren't ready to go home, so we set out driving around some of the backcountry roads. This was nothing new to us. As I said, around here you have to make your own fun, and late-night drives were always our thing. The stretch of road we were now on, I had only driven maybe once before during the day, though it wasn't far from where either of us lived. We just had no reason of going down it. While still in Carolina, the road is paved, but within a mile, it enters back into Virginia and turns into dirt. Like most of the dirt roads around here, the county doesn't really give this one much attention since it's so far out of the way, and there are very few houses on it. Since the road often washes out in the heavy rains, you have to drive much slower. Being as unfamiliar with it as we were now traveling at a crawl. While we were both more cautious now, it still just seemed as any other road we would drive. Now at this time of night, the roads are essentially empty around here, and with only a handful of houses on this road, we were certain we wouldn't run into any other traffic. The road is mainly all wooded and sits at the bottom of a small mountain. At night, it's easy to overlook any of the houses on it. We probably would have missed them all. Out of the corner of our eye, we noticed a light burning. We noticed the man standing in the porch light. We couldn't make out any features of the man, but we could tell he was watching us, standing completely motionless, with the exception of his head following us. While we were both now on edge, we tried not to think much of it. We figured it was just someone stepping out for a cigarette, but it's just his demeanor that was so uncomforting to us. While nothing came from that man watching us, this was only the beginning. We gradually picked up our speed as we were becoming a little more unnerved the more we talked about it. Within just a few minutes, though, we came to the end of the road, and we were back on the hardtop, a road that I was much more familiar with, and that I drove about once a week. We turned right, and we were feeling much better as we could pick up our speed and leave the thoughts of that man behind us. We enjoyed the sights from this road as it travels atop a small mountain ridge, offering beautiful views of the town below. After a couple miles, we had reached the end of this road and made another right to make our way back to my house. This road is a little more wooded than the one we had just turned from, but I was even more familiar with this road, as I drove or ridden it literally thousands of times before. As we're making our way back toward the main highway, we saw something up ahead in the distant reaches of my headlights. Deer are horrendous around here, so we figured that's all it was and slowed down. We began to notice it was much whiter than the brown fur of a deer, but we're both used to seeing the occasional albino, so still assumed that's all it was. As we got closer, we noticed it was no animal at all. It was definitely a human, but hunched over with their back to us. They were walking in the left lane against traffic, as one is supposed to. I looked back at my friend as he asked, "What the hell are they doing walking at this time of night?" I looked back towards the person and could finally make out the shape of an older looking woman with long, scraggly gray hair, wearing a white t-shirt and white pants. She still had her back turned to us until we were about 50 feet away from her. That's when she turned to us, and we got the first look at her face. I don't want to say she was on meth or other drugs, but that's the look she gave off. Deep eye sockets with heavy dark bags under them, greasy hair, and very aged skin. I'm not sure how old she actually was, but if I had to guess, I'd say mid-40s to late 50s. But that wasn't the worst of it. She put her hands in the air and started waving them frantically and running towards us. When she did, we could see what looked like dried blood all over the front of her shirt and pants, as well as what looked like a big knife in one of her hands. We weren't sure.
Glad I watched that.
Please. Oh, please, stop. Stop. No. Over here, you freak! No hurt him.
powder or back.
Okay. Metal cupboard.
her what she wanted, but that desire to be edgy badasses was instantly erased. We floored it and didn't let off until we reached the highway. We were so terrified of the entire ordeal that what would have usually been a 5-minute quick drive to my house became a 35-minute detour, just on the absurd thought that she could somehow follow us there. In small communities like this, you know pretty much everyone, but neither of us had ever seen this woman before, nor did we ever again. We kept a watch on local news for any stories about a bloody woman being picked up, but never heard a thing. I can't even begin to come up with an explanation why she would be walking the backcountry roads at almost 4 in the morning in her shape and condition, with blood on her clothes and a knife in her hand, with all the risks of human or animal altercation she faced. Fast forward to present day. I now live with my wife on that peaceful road on the mountain ridge, between the two roads of the incident. I take the latter one on an almost daily basis, and still have seen no sign of that strange woman since. But just earlier this year, there was a huge drug and cockfighting ring busted down the road of the Watching Man. I don't know if it was the same house, or if these people were even living in the area back then, but after all this happened, I've often wondered if that was the same house, and maybe that guy was keeping guard on the place. As for the woman, I just hope I never run into her again. We came to an agreement that we
No, fuck this!
Excitement! Are we live?
Excitement!
I can't. Yeah, we must be live because I got a thumbs up. Starting the stream. That's so.
Is it
Hi,
time?
everybody. Yeah, it's time.
Starting.
I think Skyblock at its core is the ultimate challenge in resource management. You spawn a
My wife Cheryl and I have been together for 10 years, and we got married 2 years ago. We just got a house together not even a month ago, and things couldn't have started on worse notes. We moved to a small inland town of Georgia called Waycross. That's all the details I'm giving though, to avoid any more possible issues. We're on a quiet street with a big property that sits in front of a medium-sized patch of woods, which was one of the factors that really appealed to my wife and I. We plan to adopt a dog and raise kids here, so we wanted a big property for the dog and kids to play around on. We both work similar shifts. I get home around 5 and she gets home around 6 most of the time. The first 2 nights in the house went completely normal. It was the weekend, so we spent our entire days unpacking. It wasn't until Monday night, when we were both in bed, only having turned the lights out maybe 20 minutes ago, that outside from the backyard, there was the sound of this blasting music. Our nearest neighbors on either side were spaced out enough where we couldn't mistake music from their yards being in our yard. It was definitely in our backyard, and it wasn't party music or anything like that. It sounded like very old, staticky, vintage music. The windows were shut, so after my wife and I exchanged horrified glances at each other and wondered where the music could be coming from, I opened my window on my side of the bed, and it was much clearer. There was some song that sounded like it was from the 1940s or something blasting. I later found out after looking up the lyrics that the song name was Who's Afraid of the Big Bad Wolf by Henry Hall. It has a slight eerie vibe to it for some reason, even though it was meant to be a happy song. But at the time of listening to it coming from our backyard, it was nothing but downright horrifying. We were still learning the house, but we figured there must be a backyard light switch downstairs. I ran downstairs to the back door and flicked the light switches next to the door, and one of them turned on the backyard lights. I didn't see anyone in the backyard. I opened the door, and the music was louder, obviously. But as I walked out into the grass, I realized it wasn't coming from the backyard, rather from the woods. The song played to completion as I was outside in the yard just standing there looking around. When the song ended, there was silence again. It seemed like someone must have been playing some stupid housewarming prank, but it wasn't appreciated. I went back to my wife and told her it was probably just some kids trying to scare the new ones in town for whatever reason. Hearing myself even say that, I realized how stupid and weird it sounded. Why would anyone do that? The next night, it happened again. A few minutes after we turned out the lights in the bedroom, music from outside started blasting. This time much louder, and the song playing was that song everyone's heard, Tiptoe Through the Tulips. Cheryl and I once again looked at each other, this time in genuine disgust and worry, because we had hoped it was just going to be a one-time thing, but it was happening again. I looked out the window. And this time I could see something on the grass. It wasn't a person. There was definitely something out there. I told my wife I was going to check it out. She said we should just call the cops, and I said yeah, we will in a second. I went out there with this mindset that I need to establish I'm the man of the house, not just to my wife, but to whoever was upstairs. I ran downstairs to the back door and flicked the light switches next to the door, and one of them turned on the back after my wife and I exchanged horrified glances at each other and wondered where the music could be coming from. I opened my window on my side of the bed, and it was much clearer. There was some song that sounded like it was from the 1940s or something blasting. I later found out after looking up the lyrics that the song name was Who's Afraid of the Big Bad Wolf by Henry.
Look at that! There's those.
No time to play, time to.
Who's afraid of the big bad wolf? Big bad wolf.
Henry Hall. It has a slight eerie vibe to it for some reason, even though it was meant to be a happy song. But at the time of listening to it coming from our backyard, it was nothing but downright horrifying. We were still learning the house, but we figured there must be a backyard light switch downstairs. I ran downstairs to the back door and flicked the light switches next to the door, and one of them turned on the backyard lights. I didn't see anyone in the backyard. I opened the door, and the music was louder, obviously. But as I walked out into the grass, I realized it wasn't coming from the backyard, rather from the woods. The song played to completion as I was outside in the yard just standing there looking around. When the song ended, there was silence again. It seemed like someone must have been playing some stupid housewarming prank, but it wasn't appreciated. I went back to my wife and told her it was probably just some kids trying to scare the new ones in town for whatever reason. Hearing myself even say that, I realized how stupid and weird it sounded. Why would anyone do that? The next night, it happened again. A few minutes after we turned out the lights in the bedroom, music from outside started blasting. This time much louder, and the song playing was that song everyone's heard, Tiptoe Through the Tulips. Cheryl and I once again looked at each other, this time in genuine disgust and worry, because we had hoped it was just going to be a one-time thing, but it was happening again. I looked out the window, and this time I could see something on the grass. It wasn't a person, but there was definitely something out there. I told my wife I was going to check it out. She said we should just call the cops, and I said yeah, we will in a second. I went out there with this mindset that I need to establish I'm the man of the house, not just to my wife, but to whoever was thinking they could mess with us just for being the new people on the block. When I was in the yard, I saw the object in the grass was smaller than I had thought, but the blaring, creepy song was coming from it. I realized it was an old radio. I turned it off and looked up at the window at my wife who was watching, and I held it up, yelling that someone left it there to scare us with the music. What she did next was not something I expected in response to that. She started screaming my name to run inside. She kept screaming, "Run." I yelled, "Why?" And she screamed back, "There's people standing behind you." This statement made my heart skip a beat, and I turned around to face the woods. I saw 3 figures standing like 6 feet apart from each other, clearly facing my direction. They weren't running at me, they were just standing there. I yelled, "Oh shit," and ran back inside the house, slamming the door behind me. My wife was upstairs, hysterical, crying already. I told her I'd call the cops, and I did. They arrived thankfully not that long after. All the while, we were scared to hear knocks at one of the doors or windows. My wife and I desperately explained the situation to both of the police that arrived, and I showed them the radio on the ground. I asked them if they could take it back with them as evidence for prints, and told them I only touched the top part with the handle. They did take the radio. They also checked the front of the woods with their flashlights for a few minutes. Probably just as a deterrent to the people in the woods to stop their behavior, if they were still there. When the police left, honestly, we went right back to feeling vulnerable and scared. But thank Christ the people never returned. This was only a few weeks ago, though. God forbid they came back and tried to get it on video. After going from living with my parents for 28 years to buying my first house, I'll admit it was a bit of a shock to adjust to. This was July of 2022, so very recently that I moved in. My house is a 30-minute drive from my parents' house, so we're not that far away. In my parents' house, I would always constantly be awoken at night by my dad going up and down the stairs in the middle of the night. He's basically a chronic insomniac, and constantly has to get water or go to the bathroom throughout the night. So having my own place would finally mean peace and quiet. But that doesn't mean my dad didn't pass down his inferior sleeping abilities to me, because I'm a very light sleeper too. The layout of my new house is as follows: a small unfinished basement with laundry and boiler room, first floor with living room, kitchen, bathroom, and dining room, and the upstairs with 3 bedrooms and a bathroom. One bedroom I use as an office, another one I use as a little workout room. For the first couple of days, my dad was over to help me bring in furniture and set the place up. The bulk of it was done after that, and it was just minor decorating and smaller things here and there. I'd say a week into moving in, I was practically done with the furnishings and fully at home. On a Sunday night, I could tell I was going to have a rough time trying to sleep because I was wide awake. I took a melatonin and a sleeping pill to help, and within an hour, I was out like a baby. Usually when I take these, I sleep through the night without waking up. This night, though, I woke up. A sound from outside my room woke me up. I was so dazed and confused, freshly woken up from an intense dream, that I wasn't thinking clearly. The noises from outside my room were familiar footsteps going up the stairs. My dad, as usual, waking me up with his middle-of-the-night trips up and down stairs. I tried to drown out the noise and ignore it. I was in such a daze that it didn't even hit me right away that those footsteps couldn't be my dad's. I snapped back to reality and sat up, listening. The footsteps stopped. Now that I was fully awake, I wondered if it was an auditory hallucination. Like, was it just something engraved in my memory that I heard it in my half-woken up state? I actually nervously called out, "Dad?" I didn't know what I was expecting to happen, but no one called back. I went out into the hallway outside of my room and turned on the lights to each room I passed. I made it to the stairway. I looked down the stairs at a tall man in a mask at the bottom, looking up at me. It didn't feel like a reality that I was actually staring at an intruder in my house. I didn't see any weapons on him, but I wasn't about to go fight him. I screamed at him to get the fuck out of my house, definitely with a shake in my voice. Believe it or not, he turned around and left through the front door. I ran down the stairs to lock it behind him. When I went to call my dad, I heard the back door to my house slam shut. There was a second person in the house who I didn't see. I was full on freaking out. My dad picked up, of course, because he's never asleep. He questioned why I was calling him and not the damn police. He told me to hurry, so I called the police, and the operator asked me a million questions while I waited. I was interviewed by the arriving officers, who asked me for a description of the robber, what they stole, if anything, and which direction they left in, and what vehicle. Unfortunately, I didn't think to watch them leave, so I couldn't even answer what direction they went. And I couldn't give a physical description other than one of them was tall because of the mask. It didn't actually seem like they stole anything, but I didn't have anything of real value on display on the first floor. The method of entry was a kitchen window, just big enough to climb through. Experiencing a home invasion is something you always hear about on the news, but never assume it would actually happen to you, much less right after you move into your first house. I wish I could have been more help to the police in identifying them. Now, I sleep with a knife next to my bed. When I bought my current house that I'm living in, right away my next door neighbors knocked on the door and introduced themselves. They were both as kind as could be on both sides. My house is waterfront on a canal. I wanted a waterfront house because I have a boat, so it was a no-brainer to have the convenience of keeping my boat in the water in my backyard. A house on a canal, though, means sacrificing privacy in the backyard, as the house across the canal from me looks right into my yard. From the start, even when I went to view this house for the first time, I wasn't the biggest fan of the house across the canal. It just looks like it hasn't been taken the best care of, and it's kind of an eyesore when I'm sitting in the backyard. For almost 2 weeks after moving in, I look out my window before bed every night to the house across the canal to always see the lights out. The house was always pitch black. I wondered if maybe it was a second home for whoever owned it. But then one night, things changed. On the same day that my brother helped me launch my boat into the water and bring it to my dock in the yard, just as I was about to shut the blinds in my bedroom, I looked across the canal again. And tonight, there was one light on in the house across the canal. And in that room, which looked to be a living room by the back door, there was a man standing there looking outside. So there was someone living there after all. The man was in sweatpants and a long-sleeve shirt. He looked like he had a full head of grayish hair. Based on appearance from that distance, he looked like he could be 50 on the dot. It seemed like he could have been looking at my windows. But then again, the more likely explanation was he was just looking out into the yard thinking, even though it was pitch black out there. I closed my windows and went about the rest of my night. The next day after work, I got home and set my stuff on the kitchen table, then went outside to the backyard to plant some grass seed in the yard. I couldn't help but look and notice the man standing at his back door again. This time I knew he was watching me. It was obvious. He made extended eye contact, then I looked away. I didn't want to wait, that would be weird. I tried to just pretend I didn't notice him still there looking at me. It's as if I was doing something wrong being in my own backyard. One day I had my friends over to take the boat out, and both when we were leaving and coming back, I didn't see the man at his door. I had only seen him twice so far, but already I was paranoid whenever I was outside, and always looked across the canal at his door. A few nights later, I looked out my window in my bedroom again. He was at his door again. I wondered how long he would just stand there. It was so bizarre. I turned off my lamp, and then kind of stood just beside the window peering my head out to see if he'd keep standing there even after I would turn the light out. And he did. He must have stood watching for 3 minutes, and he wouldn't move. I shut my blinds and continued with my night. I told myself from here on out I'd just ignore it and keep my blinds shut past sunset. I went to bed, wondering how I would go about confronting this situation, or if I even would. I considered maybe just going out to the dock and waving, or trying to talk to him, or even going to knock on his door to introduce myself. That sounded stressful. On this same night, while I was in bed, I was starting to drift off into sleep when I heard something in my backyard. There was someone on the deck, walking around. I could hear it. I went to the window to get a look, but I couldn't see from my upstairs window. I'd have to go downstairs if I wanted to see. But before that, there was a startlingly loud crash sound from below me. It was the window. I could tell it was the sound of shattering glass. I ran downstairs to the kitchen to grab a knife and the phone to call 911. I looked towards the back of the house and saw I was right. Glass of the backyard window was spilled out onto the floor, and one single brick laying on the wood floor, clearly what was thrown through the window. I was frightened that I'd see someone hiding in the corner of the room, but to my relief, there was not. I called 911 and requested police officers get here ASAP. Before the police arrived, I peeked out the now broken window into the yard. I turned on the back deck light. Whoever did this clearly already ran for it, but that was good. At least they didn't come into the house. When the police officers arrived at my house, I showed them the window and brick, and told them that it was most definitely the guy across the canal who'd been eyeballing me through his windows since I moved in. They asked if he had any reason to have any issue with me, and I said no chance in hell, I didn't even know the guy. I asked them to please go to his house and arrest him. They said they'd go over and knock on the door. So when another police car came to my house, the first 2 officers went to drive over to the house. And when they came back about 20 minutes later, they said nobody lived in that home. A neighbor told the police when he saw them outside that the house had been foreclosed on months ago, and the old tenant was evicted a while ago. I know nothing about foreclosures, so I asked the cops if maybe it was someone from the bank that foreclosed on the house. They said their guess is as good as mine. They recommended I install some cameras outside of my house in case the harassment continued. The police left one of their cars parked in front of my house, I guess to make me feel safer with my window being busted open now. The next morning, I woke up early and went over to that house. And I tried opening the front door and then the back door. The front door was locked, and the back door was unlocked. I quietly opened the door and took 2 steps inside of the dark, creepily empty house, and I heard something from upstairs. I noped out of there and ran back to my house. The police car was still outside my house. That day, I had my window fixed, and pretty soon installed doorbell cameras in the front and back of my house. I haven't seen that man in the house again. I still don't know if he's still in there, who he is, if he's the one who threw the brick through my window, or why. Knock on wood, things have been fine ever since. I'm a mother of 3, and so our grocery bills are quite high. My husband works at a tech company, and I currently stay at home raising the kids, who are 10, 7, and 3. I go food shopping at least twice a week, and I usually go to the King Cullen near our house, though I sometimes go to the nearby Target as well. Those are 2 of a very small list of grocery stores in our quiet town. To give as much context as possible, we're an Italian family, and I'm currently 40 years old. This happened not even a year ago when I was 39. I was running behind on shopping one day, so I went much later than usual. The King Cullen by us closes at 10, and it was definitely past 9 o'clock already, so I hurried over to the store with my flyers and coupons. The kids were complaining about a lack of food in the house, so I had to get a quick grocery run in. Most days I'd have to go shopping with my 3-year-old daughter Haley. Since it was late and my husband was home from work at this time, for once I was able to go shopping alone, which I consider a luxury. I got to the King Cullen, which was pretty void of people at this hour since it would soon be closing. I grabbed a cart and quickly started doing my laps down the aisles and grabbing whatever was on my list and whatever was on sale. I was in the cereal aisle when I got a tap on my shoulder, which startled me. I turned and saw a very tan man about my height with a baseball cap on, a black goatee, and a red zipper-up hoodie and jeans on. He laughed and apologized for startling me, and said that he'd been looking everywhere for a specific bag of chips that was in my cart, and he asked where I found them. I politely told him the aisle, and he said he checked but couldn't find it. So I actually led him exactly to where I found the chips. He thanked me with his awful breath, and I smiled and was about to walk back to my cart, but then he started making pointless conversation with me about why he liked those chips so much. Something silly like the ingredients or a lack of a specific ingredient. I kept trying to make it obvious that I was inching my way back to my cart. He wouldn't get the hint though. It was when he made a weird pause and then said, "Gosh, you're pretty," that I said thank you and that I had to get back to my shopping before they close. I went to my cart, but he followed me and kept talking to me. At this point, as politely as I could, I told him I really would just like to shop in peace. He finally seemed to get the hint and walked away, but for the rest of my time in the store that night, I kept seeing that man circling the aisles, and each time he walked past the aisle I was in, he'd slow down or even stop and just look down at me. I was getting increasingly uncomfortable and hurried up my shopping. When I was finally done, I went to the checkout, and as I emptied my cart, here comes Red Hoodie Guy with a whole 2 or 3 items. He waits on line right behind me. He doesn't say a word anymore, but I felt his gaze even through the back of my head. When I was done checking out, I pushed my cart away, and the man called out, "Have a good night, ma'am." I ignored it. As I was unloading my car, I noticed the Red Hoodie Guy in the parking lot, looking at me as he walked to his car. He got into a junky-looking Honda that must have been like 30 years old. He didn't turn the car on though, he just sat in it. I finally finished loading my car, so I got inside, started it, and began driving out of the parking lot. I looked in my rearview mirror a few times, and I didn't see any headlights behind me, so I felt safe to drive home. It wasn't until I pulled into the driveway and looked to my left down the street that I realized there was a car with its headlights off driving slowly down the street approaching our house. It pulled to the curb a few houses down. It looked to be that Honda from the parking lot. I went inside the house and called my husband's name. He came downstairs looking concerned, and I told him I was followed home by a creep.
Yeah?
He hurried outside to the stoop, but by this time the car was already gone. The following weekend, late at night when we were all in bed, we heard some shuffling around. Outside in the side yard. I shook my husband to go check what it was, and he went to slide the window open. He saw someone right below the window trying to open the side gate to the backyard, but after hearing the window slide open, the man looked up and started to run. My husband grabbed the baseball bat from under the bed and ran outside, and when he came back a minute later, he said he saw the car speeding down the street and he tried to chase after it. He perfectly described the shitty Honda that the Red Hoodie Guy was driving. It was undoubtedly him. We phoned the police, and given a late hour, a police officer arrived to our house in under 5 minutes. I described the man and his car the best I could, and that was that. He never returned to our house, not after seeing my angry husband chasing his car on foot with a bat. It still remains uncomfortable that a creep like that knows where I live, though. When I was in college, I worked at Wallbaum's. The one I worked at was a 24-hour one, so a couple unfortunate people would always be stuck working that awful shift. I thought since I was 20 and in college that my boss would never put me on an overnight shift. But unfortunately, I guess when she asked my school schedule and I told her I was off Mondays and Wednesdays, she saw me as a perfect sucker to stick on the overnight shift occasionally moving forward. One day I saw that I was scheduled for a Tuesday night from 12 a.m. to 8 a.m. I had to triple check the schedule and make sure that that was right. I felt sick seeing that, and and when I asked my supervisor why I was put on the overnight shift, he told me if I'm over 18, I don't really have a choice. I considered quitting, but I needed the job and money, so I just sucked it up and decided I'd do it this one time and then tell my boss I can't do it ever again because I have to study for school. So I arrived at the store at 12 o'clock and relieved my coworker Amanda. Half the lights in the store were out at this hour to save on electricity. There were a surprising amount of customers in the store when I got there. I guess more people than I expected would do quick midnight shopping runs. Past 1 a.m. though, the place was completely dead. Maybe 3 customers in the entire hour. As it got later in the night, there were less and less customers. It was past 2 a.m. by this point. I was as bored as humanly possible, and there hadn't been a customer in over an hour. I wondered if there were any other employees in the building. There had to be, I figured. They couldn't have a lone 20-year-old running the whole place by himself. There was some bald guy who looked like he could be a manager that kept passing by the front registers every few minutes. He had a key ring attached to his khakis with like 10 keys on it, and he was holding a small backpack-type bag in his hand. So I said, "Excuse me, are you the manager?" And he came over and asked if it was my first day on the job, to which I said it was my first night shift. He shook my hand without giving me his name, and asked me if I could go to the back warehouse of the store and organize the pallets. He said he'd watch the front. I didn't exactly know what that meant, but I'd figure it out. I walked towards the back of the store, and as I did, I saw him doing something to the entrance door of the store, like he was reaching for some switch on the side of it, as if he were locking it. I made my way into the back warehouse, where I saw a tall man who looked like he were 30, wearing a manager's vest that said wall bounce. He saw my apron and introduced himself as Rob, the night manager. I said, "Oh, I thought the guy in the front was the night manager." And he looked puzzled and said, "Who?" When I described that man from before, he asked me to show him who I was talking about, because he was the only manager on duty. He didn't even make it out of the warehouse before all the lights in the store turned off. Rob told me to wait in the warehouse while he checks out what's going on. I watched as he walked through the warehouse doors into the darkness of the store, with the only light out there being from the lights of the dairy coolers that were still on. I sat on a box on the pallet, and was on my phone trying to text any of my friends who could have been awake about what was happening, when I heard a door from inside the warehouse open. It was on the other side of the warehouse, separated by the freezer and dairy fridge. There were 2 ways in and out of the warehouse back into the store. I still sat there, now with my ears perked up, listening for any sounds, and I heard quiet, slow footsteps getting closer, followed by a voice saying, "Hey kid, you in here?" But it wasn't Rob's voice. It was that bald guy's voice. I hurried out the warehouse doors into the store, but quietly. I jogged to the front of the store looking for Rob, but I couldn't find him. I called out his name. Nothing. I grabbed my jacket and tried to open the exit door, but it wouldn't open automatically. So I tried to physically open it, but it was locked. I heard footsteps approaching from behind me, and I turned and almost screamed, but I realized it was Rob the manager. He flicked some lever or something on the top right of the door and unlocked it, and he said in a panicked whisper to hurry and get outside. He followed behind me. We left the store and he got right on the phone with the police, and I heard his whole conversation. He said he believed an armed man locked himself into the wall bounce and was probably trying to rob the place. I told him to tell the police that I think he was coming to harm me in the warehouse, which he relayed to the operator. He told me I should go wait in my car or leave. I'm sure because he didn't want the store to be held liable for anything if something were to happen. I went and sat in my car and just watched for a little while. And within 10 minutes, there were at least 4 police cars outside the store. They all went inside for a while, and I didn't see whatever was going on, so I left. I didn't quit after that, though. The next time I went into work, I was told all about what happened by my supervisor. The security footage showed that bald man circling the place, acting suspicious, checking if the coast were clear to do whatever he was planning to do after locking the doors. He cut the lights in the store. The cameras showed him going straight to the warehouse where he told me to go. That's the scariest part to me, because if he were armed and robbing the place, he could have been on his way to put a gun to my head or something. The camera showed him leaving through the emergency exit in the warehouse way before the police arrived. In the end, I never worked an overnight shift again after talking to my boss, and I stayed at that job for another few months. I'm not sure if that man was ever identified. I used to work as a night restock worker at a supermarket in a somewhat rural town. The store was called Great American. It was the biggest and best supermarket in the area. My shift would be as soon as the store would close at 10. I'd work from 10 p.m. to 3 a.m. the latest, restocking the shelves and organizing everything before the next operating day. I of course had the keys to the store for the after hours. It would be a team of 2, myself and one other, either Terry, Carter, or Alfonso. Tonight I was supposed to be working with Terry. I arrived to the store and let myself into the back where all the inventory yet to be stocked was. I started my work using the pallet jack to bring a whole pallet of boxes out to the shopping floor. I started with the bread and nuts aisle, rotating the older loaves in the front and putting the newer loaves in the back. Halfway through, I realized I hadn't seen Terry yet. I walked to the back area of the store where the inventory was, where we'd leave our belongings. He wasn't back there yet. I left the back door cracked open with a door stopper for him when he would show up. So I went back to work for another half hour. And with still no sign of Terry, I once again went to the back of the store. He wasn't in there, but I noticed the back door was shut. I assumed that meant Terry was here somewhere. I went to open the back door and saw the door stopper was outside, which I thought was weird that he kicked it outside instead of bringing it in. I called Terry's name and it echoed through the room. He didn't call back, so I decided to call him. He picked up, sounding like he was in bed, and I asked him if he was at work. He said he wasn't coming in tonight because he was sick. Suddenly I got the chills. I told him someone kicked the door stopper off the door, and he said it could have just come undone itself. Nobody else was scheduled to work that night. I told him feel better, and we hung up. I wasn't sure if I was convinced that the door stopper came undone itself, because I kicked it under the door pretty tightly. I did a quick look around just to make sure no one was in the back of the store. And when I didn't see anyone, I went back to work, though I felt a slight sense of unease the whole time. I was stocking the remainder of the bread when I heard a loud sound echo from across the shopping floor. Okay, now someone had to be in here. I got off my knees and went to the middle aisle that intersected all the other aisles. I looked straight down the aisle and stood there for a hot second. And all the way on the opposite side of the store in the dairy aisle, a man dressed in black walked past the middle aisle, looking down in my direction. I felt my heart drop. It felt like that scene from the movie Signs where the alien walks past the birthday party. I had to think logically that maybe this was someone else filling in for Terry's shift that our boss didn't tell me about. I started to speed walk down the center aisle and yelled "excuse me" very loudly. I looked to the left down every aisle I passed since he went towards the front of the store. In one of those aisles, he was waiting at the end of it, standing there fully facing my direction. When he saw me, he walked out of sight in the direction I was just coming from. I yelled "excuse me" again and started to run down that aisle to catch up to him. I didn't get a good look at his face yet. When I got to the front of the aisle by the cash registers, I looked down the direction he went, and I saw him all the way at the end by the bread aisle. Half his body was hidden behind the shelf. His mouth was hanging open. And he started to wave me over, but he didn't say anything. His face was freaking me out. I attempted one more time to speak to him and said, "Who are you?" And he disappeared behind the shelf. I wasn't being paid enough for this. I went outside to sit in my car and call my boss. He picked up and I told him there was some random freak roaming around the store. He told me to get him out of there if I can, or call the police to get him out. I was not going to attempt to physically remove a crazy person from the store, so I called 911. I waited in my car until a police car showed up. I greeted the officer and asked him to follow me inside. We walked around the place looking for the man, and we saw him at one of the aisles again, creepily standing there again as if playing a game. When the police officer commanded him to come here, he actually listened. He was put in handcuffs, and he was the strangest man I'd ever seen. He kept smiling and looking at me non-stop, licking his lips. He had huge bags under his eyes. The only words he spoke were when answering the police officer, saying he was looking for a snack. I didn't like the way he was looking at me as the police officer was walking him back outside to his car. It was this menacing, threatening smile that I haven't forgotten to this day. I continued my work after that. Needless to say, I never left any of the doors open again. I'm I'm a police officer in South Jersey. I've been doing this since I was 23. For the most part, it's not as exciting as it's cracked up to be. Not a whole lot happens in my county. Usually the worst calls are disturbance calls or an occasional shoplifting, with something a little more serious sprinkled in there once in a blue moon. I've done just about every possible shift there is. I did my time on the night shift, and there were definitely some weirder calls during the night shift than the day shift. But this one time I was working the night shift, I didn't get any calls. I was just cruising on a quiet road with no streetlights and woods on both sides. I saw the reflection of taillights suddenly approaching on the right-hand side of the road on the grass. As I got closer, I saw that the driver's side door was open. I started to veer onto the grass as I slowed down, fully planning on getting out to see if the driver needed assistance. I saw someone step out of the car, stand by the door for a second, then started to run into the woods. I radioed the codes for a suspicious person or vehicle, then got out of the car with my flashlight on and my hand on my holster just in case. In this situation, I had to expect the worst. I got to the front door of the car and looked inside, half expecting to see someone else sitting there, but the car seemed empty. There was a seriously foul odor emanating from inside the car, though. It smelled like a rotting animal. I called out to the woods, asking if anybody's there and needs assistance, and I stepped to the tree line, waving the flashlight around. I went back to the car to take a closer look inside the passenger side. There were multiple bloodied tissues and paper towels on the floor on the passenger side, as well as the rear seats. They were soaked in blood. The entire papers were dark red. At some point while looking inside the car, I heard footsteps inside the woods. I spun around with my flashlight and yelled, "Come out of the woods." I didn't see anyone. Someone was hiding in there, and that was confirmed when I heard a deep voice somewhere beyond the trees and shrubs. I had no idea what the voice said. I responded saying, "Show yourself, are you hurt?" I prepared to unholster my gun as I walked a little closer. I repeated myself, asking, "Are you hurt?" No response. The voice I heard before didn't sound like a person in pain bleeding out. Additionally, why would they run into the woods upon seeing a police car? Something was way off. I went back to the car and requested assistance. I noticed as I investigated the car further that it had no plates, and when I went back inside of the rear, I found something that made me almost puke from shock. There was something heavy wrapped in bloodied paper towel. I unwrapped it with my gloves on to find a severed hand, and it took me a hot second to realize what it was, because it was completely dark red soaked in blood. Now the situation went from a 5 to a 10. I radioed that there was a possible murder and needed backup. I now put my cruiser's lights on to help other officers more easily identify my location. When backup arrived, we did a thorough search of the woods, looking for possible blood trails. Nothing though. There were not even any blood trails leading from the car, which meant that the hand and blood on the tissues I found may not have been from the person who I saw run into the woods. Eventually the canine unit had to come and search for the person. Hours upon hours went into this search, well past dawn, turning up nothing. The vehicle was taken into custody. It had been reported stolen by a resident of a nearby town, who said he had no idea who could have stolen his car. Fingerprints had been collected from the steering wheel, and DNA testing had been done on the hand. There was not a single match to anybody in the database. To this day, there was never any progress in finding out who the driver of that car was, and whose severed hand that was. My partner and I are assigned to a unit in the sheriff's department that handles tethers, or ankle monitors. One night while looking for someone that absconded the program, we followed her last known location to a somewhat shady area of our county. Not many stops are routine, but this one was unsettling from the beginning. My partner walked to the front door, as I held the side of the house, keeping my focus on him and the side of the house. After knocking on the door, we could hear movement from inside. As the door opened, a middle-aged woman slowly peered out of the door and looked directly at me. There was no way she knew where I was standing. I was not in view of any window at the front or side of the house. What was strange was that most people would answer the person at the front door, not look at the side of the house first. After a moment, she let us in after we asked if she knew who Camille was, who we were searching for. She mumbled something to the effect that she was there. Things went from 0 to 100 immediately as she dropped to her hands and knees and started scooting on the floor, yelling for Camille. This lady had some obvious mental issues, and we figured this Camille was a caretaker of some kind. We both knew the situation was off and started searching the house. The entire time this woman was yelling for Camille, never once getting back to her feet, just kind of following us on the ground. The time must have been around 8 p.m. and it was dark outside. The inside of the home had one light on. There were no TVs or any electronics of any kind. The house had a strange feeling to it. The layout of this older style home had about 4 bedrooms and 2 floors. Every time I left a room, I swear I was in a part of the house I had not just been in. I would enter a hallway and seemingly be in another part of the house, like I entered a dimensional gap or something. The woman would sometimes be right behind me without making a sound. I was starting to question how all of this was possible. At one point, we both entered the upstairs, which looked to be a regular upstairs with bedrooms, or maybe a bathroom at the top of the stairs. As we tried to open the door, initially it would not budge. It appeared that it had been sealed somehow, like it had been painted over, and paint had dried in the seams of the door. After putting in a little extra effort, the door opened, revealing an attic, not bedrooms. If you remember Paranormal Activity, when the guy finds a picture of his wife and child in the insulation, that's what it looked like. There was nothing but storage space, insulation, and an older style light bulb with a string hanging from it. The lady was just sitting at the bottom of the stairs watching us, occasionally yelling for Camille. After what seemed like an hour of searching this house over and over again, going into rooms I swear I had just left, we called it and cleared the property. As we drove off, the woman was now standing right in front of the door, staring at us as we left. According to when we called dispatch and when we cleared, we were only there for 20 minutes. It felt like we were there for well over an hour or 2. I don't know what was more unsettling, the fact that it was late at night, the lady yelling Camille's name and scooting on her hands and knees, her quietly showing up behind me when I had not heard her move, or the fact that she was standing at the door just staring at us as we left. We have not returned to that house. My family and I lived throughout the middle of Georgia. Not many stories come out of this area, and this one I'm about to share makes us glad of that fact. My cousin, who I'll call Bob, has been a police officer for 5 years. He went into the force bright-eyed and optimistic, I guess like so many did. It sounds corny, but he genuinely wanted to make a difference and help improve the lives of the people in his community. One day, they got an alert from a house somewhere between Macon and Roberta. To hear Bob tell it, it was a place that people had thought was abandoned for years. Gives you an idea of the state the house was in. Anyway, when they arrived, an older gentleman was sitting on the steps outside the front door with his hand in his pockets. Bob and the other officer approached him and were alarmed to see that the man was crying. Well, not crying really, but sobbing. He was also muttering something to himself about how awful it is. They tried to question the man, but the guy was completely incoherent. It didn't take but a couple of seconds to figure out that the poor guy was traumatized. As his partner called for another car, Bob drew his gun and decided to enter the house. The smell inside the house was overpoweringly rancid. He told me that the kitchen and living room were a total wreck. It was clear the owners of the house were hoarders. Pots and pans stacked damn near to the ceiling, spoiled food all over the table, takeout containers scattered all over the floor. Disgusting. As procedure dictates, Bob called out to see if anyone would answer. Silence. He told me that even with all his training and experience over those past 5 years, his heart rate was already building fast. Gun at the ready, he checked out the living room and saw nobody was there either. He made his way down the hall where the smell was getting much worse. Just as it all became too much, he covered his mouth and nose and opened the door to what he suspected was the bedroom. In the bed were 2 corpses, gray-skinned and covered with flies. Despite his churning stomach, Bob decided to go in for a closer look, a decision he said he's regretted since. One of the corpses was male, the other female. The skin on their faces was already starting to fall off, and the flies were flying in and out of their mouths. Some were landing and sitting on their eyeballs. As Bob inspected the female's corpse, He was horrified to find that she was holding an even smaller dead body, an infant. It wasn't until a large cockroach crawled out of the dead infant's mouth that Bob ran outside the house, doubled over, and threw up his lunch all over the steps the man had been sitting on. When the other cars finally arrived, they were able to do a more thorough inspection. The older man that Bob and his partner had met when they first arrived was a former co-worker and friend of the dead man. They'd worked together at a peach packing company. The man hadn't showed up for over a week, and he'd gone to their house to see if he was okay. The poor man had been the first to see that horrible sight in the bedroom. The story that they put together was that the wife and husband had at some point become addicted to opioids. After some kind of operation a year or so before, they had started abusing painkillers together, and the addiction grew and grew until they started shooting up and snorting heroin. Their daughter, who wasn't more than a couple years old, had died of neglect. When the husband and wife discovered their baby's corpse, they finally broke completely and decided to end themselves. The coroner found enough heroin in both their bodies to kill them twice over. Bob's still on the force, but he started drinking a little too much after that. He's been going to therapy and since managed to get his drinking under control. And almost every time we talk, he says that he still has nightmares about that poor child's corpse. And in his nightmares, the baby's still crying. I once responded to a call of a possible breaking and entering. A young woman living alone called in fear, saying that she came home to find a broken window downstairs, but nothing seemed to be stolen and she couldn't find anyone inside. But then when she went upstairs to bed, she thought she could hear footsteps moving around downstairs. The call disconnected shortly after she said that, and the woman wouldn't pick up to any of the attempted callbacks. I took the call and arrived to the little house. I went to knock on the front door, and after a minute, I gave it another set of knocks and pressed the doorbell. After another minute, I tried one more time, this time banging really loudly and ringing the bell again. When there was no answer this time, I decided to inspect the house. I walked around the house, and I found the busted window. It was a window big enough to crawl through with ease. I stuck my head into the dark house and yelled, "It's the police." It was silent. I radioed to dispatch that the house seemed silent. More officers were en route, but I didn't feel right waiting around in case there was someone truly in danger in the house. I radioed that I'm going into the house through the window, and I climbed through it. I stepped over the shattered glass into the kitchen. I drew my gun and started walking through the kitchen, hearing the glass crunching below my boots. I shouted into the house to make my presence as a police officer known to anyone who was inside. I didn't hear any footsteps, so I went upstairs, as the woman on the phone told dispatch that she heard footsteps downstairs, so that would mean her bedroom was upstairs. I wasn't trying to be too quiet as I went up the stairs, but I also wasn't stomping around. I didn't know what to expect, if someone with a weapon was in the house, or if the woman was just alone in bed. I said, "Ma'am, it's a police officer. Are you here?" And I heard back a soft female voice from upstairs saying, "Yes." I followed the voice to one of the bedrooms, where I saw a woman sitting up in her bed under the covers. She looked at me, and I asked if she was okay. She said she was fine. I noticed a slight tremble in her voice. I kept the lights to the bedroom off as I looked at her. There was enough natural moonlight in the room that I could examine her facial expression. She looked distressed. I told her I was responding to her phone call, and then I asked her why she hung up and didn't pick up the callbacks. She stuttered and said no one is here. I caught on to what was going on. I looked at the closet and made a slight head nod to her. She very slightly shook her head no. I looked down under the bed and pointed, and she shook her head yes. The weight of the pressure of what to do next was 1,000 pounds. The best idea I came up with on the spot was telling her, "All right, ma'am, I just need you to sign this report form stating that I was here and there was nothing unusual." She said okay and got up from the bed and came over to me. And when she was close enough, I pushed her out of the room and then drew my gun and yelled, "Come out from under the bed." I was still shook when I saw a dark figure actually slowly coming out from under the bed. I said, "Hands first and drop any weapons." I heard the clank of something drop to the floor, which turned out to be a gun. A middle-aged man in all black clothes stepped out from under the bed with his hands up. I made the arrest on the spot and brought him outside, right around the time the other officers were arriving. The woman had hung up the phone on the police when she thought the footsteps were upstairs, and she didn't want the intruder to hear the audio from the phone call. This was also why she didn't pick up the phone, because by this point, the intruder entered the room and had her at gunpoint. Since the police were already coming, for whatever reason, instead of fleeing the scene, the intruder threatened to shoot the woman if she made a sound when the police came. After I had rung the bell, he hid under the bed and told her to pretend he wasn't there. I'm glad I was able to catch on to the situation. It could have gone a number of ways if I hadn't. When I was in high school, I had a couple of close friends, Jason and Brian. We did quite a bit together, and when it came time to graduate, Jason had to move away to Lexington, South Carolina with his family due to his father's work. After we graduated and he had completed his move with his family, my friend Brian and I were invited to pay a visit for a weekend to his new house. We decided out of boredom to start hiking around in the nearby forest and countryside, which we found had a scenic river. It was a beautiful area. It felt quite peaceful, but we ended up getting lost. We decided to keep following the river as we lost track of which direction was upstream or downstream, with no sounds of civilization anywhere we could hear. We quickly became concerned about finding a telephone to call Jason's mom or dad to get us from wherever we were, even though there was no paved road or street that we could find nearby. As we kept following the river, we came to this old church-looking building made of really old red bricks with a dirt parking lot and a dirt road leading up to it. It was very encroached with growth and bushes. We decided to go inside and see if there were people, and maybe ask to use their telephone and get the address for this location. We noticed there were a few old cars, which looked to be 70s or 80s, possibly Novas, 4 of them. Very dirty and rusted in this dirt parking lot with flat or missing tires. They were all white-colored, or used to be, and parked in a row side by side. As we got closer, we heard gospel music sounds and some singing inside the church. We were relieved that there were people, so we went into the church, which appeared to be rather old and dilapidated. We peeked past the main doors to the hall and saw what I estimated was a couple dozen people dressed as nicely as they could, though they clearly were poor. When we went inside, the old white-haired woman wearing horn-rimmed glasses who was playing the church piano stopped playing, and she looked at us with no expression on her face. What happened next really stuck with me, and I will never forget it as long as I live. Everyone in that church stopped singing and put down their song sheets, and they all slowly turned their heads and looked at us with the most vacant and unwelcoming glares. Jason said, "We're sorry to interrupt. We just want to use your phone to call my folks to come get us." Nobody spoke. It was dead silent in that church, other than the wooden pews creaking from the weight of the people in them. So we just slowly backed out of the door and let it close behind us. We looked at each other in ominous fear and quietly left. We started walking up that dirt road, and when Brian mentioned that there were no crosses or anything Christian in there, we looked back up the road to see that maybe a dozen of those people, all men, had walked out in the front of the church and were standing there watching us intently as we walked along the road. This freaked us out, and we began to sprint up that dirt road for what felt like a good half hour. We finally came to a very old, broken-down gas station that looked like one of those old full-service stations. We went inside to find that the shelves were mostly empty and dusty from a quick glance. An old, overly tanned, swarthy man with a really oily and dirty baseball cap was behind the counter reading some old book with ragged edges and yellowed pages. He looked up and said, "You boys lost, huh? Just head out that way you came in and make a left, and follow that road till you see a telephone pole. And just go right at the pole down the trail and it'll take you to a highway." We thanked the man and left quickly, and as we walked down the road to the telephone pole the man told us about, again looked back, and the old man was out in front of the gas station with his arms folded, just staring at us with a rotten-toothed grin on his face. We got to the pole, made the right, and followed that trail to the nearest highway, after about a good half hour of walking in the twilight. It had just gotten dark as we got to the highway, and we tried to wave down a few people passing by, but nobody stopped. Thankfully, a police officer saw us and pulled over to help us. We told him we were lost and gave him Jason's address, to which he whistled and said we really were lost. It took about 30 minutes for that officer to drive us back to Jason's. And during the chit-chat, he told us we needed to be careful out in those woods, as there are some crazy witch folks in it. A long time ago, I'm talking like 8 years ago, 2 friends and I, James and Sean, did something really stupid. But at the time, doing stupid things was what we did to pass the time. We're not really friends with James anymore, but Sean and I still talk often, and so oftentimes we'll talk with each other about this story. We were 19 years old. We lived in Bumfuck, New Jersey. Lots of vacant houses in our old town. And atop a hilly road not far from our houses was an abandoned church. Locals knew about the church. It was on a closed-off road, and it had been abandoned for many years. I'm not sure if it's still standing or what the current state of it is, as I live in Florida now. But James, Sean, and I, being the troublemaking thrill-seekers we were, came up with this genius plan of bringing a Ouija board to the church late one night. This was October, so I guess we were doing it in honor of spooky season. Sean had the Ouija board in his closet, so he brought it. I drove the 3 of us, so I first picked up James, then Sean, and we just drove straight towards the church. Since the road up the hill to the church was literally blocked off, we had to park on the side of the road and walk from there. We followed the road up the hill to the church, using one flashlight at first, so as not to overdo it and draw any possible attention. But once we were atop the hill, pretty much all 3 of us turned on our flashlights. The church was surrounded by woods in basically all directions, and had a gravel parking lot alongside it. The church had been broken into a million times before, and was littered with graffiti, so the big front door was already ajar. 2 of us had to work together to pull it open because it scraped on the floor though. There was a house by me nicknamed Ghost House because construction was never finished on it for the longest time, and it had been sitting vacant and unfinished for years. It was on an already kind of sketchy block with a lot of houses that appeared to be either vacant or the owners of the houses just don't care about their properties, because there's a lot of overgrown grass and weeds. My friends Jenny, Luca, Kylie, and I were bored just driving around town late one night. We got some fast food. Then Luca floated the idea of checking out the ghost house. Like, actually checking it out, going inside. The girls were on board, so of course, so was I too then. We parked a few houses down. This street only had one street light. The rest of it was dark, and a lot of the houses didn't have any lights on. So it really was a dark and kind of creepy block. Like I said, the neighboring houses seemed abandoned too, even though they weren't due to cars being in some of the driveways. We were all sure to be extra quiet getting out of the car and walking over to the ghost house. Seeing this unfinished 2-story house in the dead of night gave off eerie vibes for sure. Next up, we had to figure out a way in. Of course, we tried the front door and it was locked. We then walked around the house trying every window until one of them slid right open. Jenny was the smallest, so she climbed in through the window and then went to unlock the back door for us. It was already unlocked, meaning anyone could have just walked right in. We entered the house that smelled like a mix of wood and some kind of rotten cat piss kind of smell. The first floor was a lot more finished than I was expecting. It was pretty big with lots of rooms, but there was no furniture. We kind of all split up going different ways. I went up the stairs to the second floor. Up here was a bit more unfinished, with a lot of the wall framing exposed. I heard rustling around from downstairs, the sounds of my friends being a bit too loud, so I went really loud down the stairs. Upstairs was pretty empty, so I went back down to run into Jenny, who asked what's upstairs. I said it's a bit unfinished up there. She then proceeded to go upstairs and check it out anyway. I proceeded to look for the basement, and I found it beyond a brown door right under the stairs leading upstairs. As soon as I opened it, I got a whiff of that cat piss type smell I was talking about. I started walking down the steps, and as I got to the bottom, I could see the basement looked a little more decrepit than the rest of the house. The concrete floor was stained with some brownish, rusty-looking material. My first instinct was to think paint, but the color could also match blood. I looked around the mostly empty space and found in one corner a small wooden chair and a little table with a book on it. It was the Holy Bible. I heard footsteps coming down the steps. I said in a volume slightly above a whisper, "Yo, come check this out." When I heard no response, I turned around but didn't see anyone by the stairs. I said, "Who's there?" Then I noticed a girl sitting down, leaning on the wall. It took me a second to realize it wasn't Jenny or Kylie. It was some random woman with extremely long and messy hair looking right at me. Then I heard one of the girls upstairs screaming, followed by Luca calling my name saying, "Let's get out of here." The only words I could muster up were "holy shit." I ran out of the basement and up the stairs. I saw my friends running out through the back door. I had no idea what they had seen, and I was right behind them. We ran back out front towards the car and didn't stop until we were in. I asked them as we started to drive away what they saw, because I saw some deranged-looking woman come down to the basement. Everyone was talking over each other, but one of the girls finally managed to explain that they saw two men standing in one of the empty rooms on the first floor. They saw some dark objects on the floor in that room, but they couldn't find out what they were in those brief seconds before running away. They didn't get a look at their faces, but they were men based on their statures. I don't know what the hell was going on in that house. And if we ran into some satanic cult, or if we just ran into some homeless people. You couldn't pay me to ever go back to that house again. I don't live in that town or state anymore, so I don't know what became of that house. But based on the most recent Google Maps picture from 2019, it still wasn't ever finished.
My friends and I live in a very nice area. Try and picture the quintessential suburban neighborhood. It's relatively quiet, and people are used to the secluded, isolated feel it provides. The last place you'd expect anything dangerous to really happen. With the exception of what I'm about to tell you, my town radiated the calming silence you'd eventually come to crave. This happened a few summers ago, and as much as I try to resist it, I will never be able to erase the memory from my mind. Anyway, my friend Chaz and I had always been those kids to try to cause trouble wherever we could. Looking back, I struggled to justify our behavior. I guess it was our teenage manifestation of a rebellious spirit or some shit like that. We lived on the same street and hung out after school every single day. Because our neighborhood consisted of nothing but very large houses and towering trees, we didn't usually have much to do on weekdays, unless we wanted to journey a few towns over. So we ended up making our own fun most of the time. In our neighborhood, there was a well-known mansion at the top of a hill that had been abandoned for as long as people could remember. It wasn't really special. Every kid who lived in my town had been inside. The rooms were essentially stripped of anything of value, and finding a wall that wasn't coated with multiple layers of spray paint was almost impossible. It was especially creepy because it stood at the edge of a massive cemetery. For Chaz and I, this cemetery mansion was a kind of default, a plan B if we will. If we had nothing else to do, we'd throw some graffiti up inside or just smoke and chill on the roof. This was one of those nights. It was like 3 a.m. on a Wednesday, and Chaz and I had just been flaked on by a couple girls that we made plans with. The two of us were kind of upset, but we figured chucking rocks at the cemetery mansion would be a decent way to release some energy. Had we been sober, we might have been more cautious about doing something so stupid. But it was late, it was summer, and we didn't care. I convinced Chaz not to drive. We were more than a little drunk. And after about a 20-minute walk, we crested the hill and were met with a familiar yet eerie sight. Vines twisting and hanging down the muddied bricks, most of the windows shattered, menacing points at the tip of the roof. Definitely a sinister feel, especially at such an ungodly hour of the night. Without warning, Chaz picked up a stone and chucked it towards the house. It sailed gracefully before smashing through one of the fourth-floor windows. It was difficult to confirm in the low light of the moon and surrounding streetlights, but the deafening sound of the shattering glass confirmed it. Gleefully, I picked up a rock and did the same, puncturing one of the second-floor windows. Before the mansion's fourth floor, there was a single small window, probably an attic, that stood lonely as the highest room in the house. Chaz challenged me to hit it. I missed a good 10 throws before giving up with an aggravated sigh. Chaz grinned, picked up a rock, and said, "Watch this." He took a long look at the tiny target and launched it. I watched in awe as the rock flew through the air, shattering the attic window with a satisfying crash. I was shocked. The two of us stood there for a second, admiring what just happened. Chaz was about to pick up another rock, when I, still looking at the shattered window, saw a dark object fly out of the emptiness and sail down towards us. I literally jumped, confused as to what I just saw.
Chaz and I looked down at the rock that had just landed on the gravel in front of us, the exact same rock Chaz had just thrown. It was easily recognizable, as it had a sort of Z imprint on one of the faces. The two of us stood there in silence, obviously a little shaken up. It was really late for other kids to be doing the same thing we were, but that was the only explanation we could come up with. We agreed that it must have been a group of teenagers trying to mess with us, an idea that actually excited us. The devious grins on our faces told the story. We were going to try and get the jump on them before they could scare us. The two of us quietly made our way to the front door, ducking under a thick vine that hung from the towering pillars above. The door was slightly ajar, but it always was. It had long since been misaligned from its hinges and didn't close properly. As quietly as we could, we stepped inside, our eyes adjusting to the minimal light and our noses to the smell of mildew and rotting wood. We slowly made our way up the creaky stairs, unable to silence the sound of shifting wood beneath our feet. We had made it to the 4th floor and were positioned at the base of the final staircase. Interestingly, we had never been up there. The entrance to the roof was on the opposite side of the house, and this room must have eluded us. Chaz took the lead, and I followed directly behind. The staircase led to a small wooden door, which we presumed was the attic door. Chaz put a hand on the doorknob, and even looked back at me. I nodded, and in one fluid motion, he flung the door open. Before I could even see anything, I was struck by the smell that made me take a few reactionary steps backward. It was disgusting. It smelled like death and rot. Something was clearly decaying in that room. Chaz covered his nose and entered. I was a little more hesitant to do so, but I decided that I'd rather be by his side than alone on a pitch-black staircase. The sight was even worse than the smell. We found ourselves staring at a tiny room, the floor of which a white pentagram was painted. There were a few unlit candles and a closet door that we didn't open. The smell seemed to be emanating from that closet, and I was worried Chaz would want to investigate more. To our surprise, the room was void of people. I had enough, though. This was really starting to freak me out, and I couldn't fight the urge to leave any longer. I turned towards the door, and that's when I saw it. I looked down the staircase and saw 2 cloaked figures looking back up at me. I cursed and ran towards Chaz. Just then, we heard stomping up the stairs from behind us. We were screwed. As the stomping got closer to the door, I was prepared to fend off whoever it was, bracing myself for a fight. Just then, Chaz yelled at me, "Dude, come on." I whipped around to see Chaz halfway out of the shattered window, presumably stepping on the roof. I hurriedly did the same, and the second I made it onto the roof, I heard the door forcefully open. We ran across the roof to the entrance we knew about, not wanting to wait to see if we were being followed. Had the situation not been so dire, I don't know if I would have been able to go through with our plan. The darkness made it nearly impossible to see. One wrong step and we would have been sent tumbling to our deaths. I followed close behind Chaz, and we made it to the roof entrance. There was a little hatch that led to a ladder. Chaz failed to open the hatch up. It was locked from the inside. And just then, we heard a booming voice ring out from somewhere in the distance. "They went that way," yelled a freakishly deep voice. To this day, it was the scariest thing I've ever heard anyone say. Without thinking, I stomped on the hatch as hard as I could with my right foot, and it gave way and it crashed loud enough to reveal our position to anyone in the house, let alone someone chasing us on the roof. The force of the impact caused me to fall into the hole, and had it not been for my hands reflexively grabbing the ladder, I wouldn't have been seriously hurt. Chaz screamed at me to go, so I climbed down as fast as I could, trying to ignore the pain in my leg. The two of us sprinted down the other staircase and burst out the back door, jumping the fence and running into the cemetery. Chaz seemed to be fine. He was literally laughing. I, on the other hand, was so scared I could barely think. I never thought squatting behind a gravestone in the cemetery could be so comforting. Chaz and I maintained a watchful eye on the mansion, half expecting someone to be following us. We waited, and just when we thought the coast was clear, we saw a group of 4 or 5 cloaked figures circling the property, frantically searching under bushes and trees. The two of us crept closer into the cemetery, until we were sure there was no chance we could be spotted in the darkness. We hopped the backside fence, and haven't been back to that house since. I can only assume that we stumbled upon some kind of cult meeting or ritual. Why they decided to do it in an abandoned house is something I still ask myself. This was the year 2017, when I was rushing a frat in college.
Towards the end of our pledge process, our entire pledge class took a trip to an abandoned hospital a few towns over. It was a sort of tradition that each pledge class would do. I carpooled with a few of my pledge brothers. There's honestly just too many names to list, so I'll just name my pledge brother that I spent most of the night with, Joshua. Joshua and I and a couple others carpooled to the hospital, which sat next to a big park. So all of us parked in one of the parking lots in the park. We waited till everyone was there, then started walking down a pathway in the direction of the hospital, until the pathway cut right, and at this point we had to walk through the small patch of woods separating the park from the hospital. I honestly wore the wrong shoes for this. I was complaining about wearing my white Air Force Ones. After making our way through the woods, we got to the property of the hospital, surrounded by trees and a parking lot on all sides. Seeing such a tall building, once full of people and lights, standing completely dark in the night, was really creepy. It was my first time ever exploring this building. A couple of the guys in the group knew the secret ways in, one of which being simply climbing through one of the lower windows that was smashed through. I followed close to the back of the group. One by one, we stepped down through this window, leading to a level beneath the ground. The floor on this level was wet, making me really regret my shoe choice now. Joshua and I stayed in the back, following behind the rest. There were like 10 of us, so being in such a large group took away most of the scariness of being in a place like this. We went up the stairs. Everyone's steps echoed through the building. We traversed the creepy hallways that had been abandoned for decades. The walls surprisingly not littered with graffiti. James, one of the guys who was very experienced with this place, said not a lot of people break in because no one thinks to cut through the park to avoid the security in front of the parking lot. Eventually the group started to split up a little bit. A small group of guys went this way, a small group of guys went that way. We were on, I think, the second floor, when Joshua and I decided to go down this separate hallway/corridor. Some of the rooms in this place seemed like they hadn't even been gone through since the place closed down. Others looked like they'd been rummaged through, and had small amounts of graffiti in them. Joshua and I were in a hospital room with the bed and medical equipment still in there, when we heard someone walk past the doorway to the room. I both turned and caught just a glimpse of a black shadow walking past the door out of view. We both looked at each other, then said, "Yo, who is that?" I walked into the hall, and at the end of it I saw someone, standing there. I couldn't tell if they were facing me or facing the wall. All I saw was their body. I said, "Who is that?" Then whoever it was walked into the room next to them. Joshua came into the corridor now. He was confused at what I saw. I told him someone was here, and we should just go back to the group. We left down the opposite direction, back towards our group. We eventually started to hear the echoing voices of our pledge brothers. As we were getting closer, all of a sudden, there was an almost deafeningly loud, blood-curdling scream of a woman coming from the direction we just came from. If I had to describe the screams, it sounded like a woman being brutally stabbed to death. I noticed the sounds of our pledge brothers went silent now, or maybe the screams just overpowered the sounds of their voices. We ran back towards our friends and screamed, "Go!" All of us ran back downstairs to the lower level where we entered from. Somehow I found myself in the back of the group again. One by one, we all crawled out from that window. The screaming stopped, but now we heard footsteps stomping down the stairs. They weren't the footsteps of anyone in our group. I was screaming, "Go, hurry up." Finally, after Joshua crawled out, I crawled out, the whole time fearing someone would grab my feet. We booked it back towards the cars through the woods. After we got to the cars and caught our breath, I told everyone I saw a person in the corridor where Joshua and I were. That's where the screams were coming from. We all left shortly after that, definitely freaked out. I'm not really interested in urban exploration anymore. My childhood friend Carter moved away with his family to this really rural town in Michigan, but we've always stayed in touch. His family is very country, and I'd go as far as to say they're kind of rednecky, so the move there was no surprise. His family loves me, and I'm always welcome to go visit. We're 19 now, I'm in college, Carter works for his dad. They have a huge property up there,
visited before. This was not my first time going up there. So it was a weekend in the fall. I was going to stay at Carter's family home up there. His mom and his sister wouldn't be there this weekend. It was just him and his dad. It's a 4.5-hour drive up there. It's a lot of farmland and open fields by them. To get onto their property was a gravel road about 300 feet off the main road. I got there to a warm welcome by both Carter and his dad. They were already sitting in the backyard drinking beers, so after bringing my bag in from the car, I joined them. Carter was telling me about all the trails in the area that we could take my Toyota 4Runner off-roading. I'd never off-roaded before, but I was super down to. Carter's dad grilled us up some burgers first, then he was off to his friend's house. Carter and I got in my car, and he guided me to this nearby trail that he described as perfect for off-roading. It was around 6 o'clock, so we only had a couple hours of light left. We did about an hour of off-roading on various trails not far from Carter's house. When it was starting to get a little darker out, we left the trails and got back on the road because it was even darker when you're in the middle of the woods. And we were just driving around, passing a bunch of farmland. We passed this abandoned church-looking building that had a huge cornfield next to it. Carter said he passes this place all the time, but he never checked it out. So what do? Of course, we both agreed to go back and check it out later, but Carter said we should take the bikes over later. His family has 1 million mountain bikes, fully equipped with lights and everything. We drove back to his house. He grabbed a backpack and threw some tequila and a bottle of Sprite in it, along with some flashlights. We took the 2 best bicycles they had. Each had night riding lights mounted on the handlebars. He said it would probably be a 20-minute bike ride. Both of us are big fitness guys, and have been since high school, so I didn't even mind a long bike ride. When we got to the abandoned building, it was pretty dark out now, and that's why we brought flashlights. The grass was very overgrown too. We made sure no cars were coming before entering the property just to be safe. We hid our bikes a little bit into the cornfield just so they wouldn't be seen. There was still just enough light outside to navigate without turning on the flashlights. We didn't want to make it too obvious we were here. We were thinking of getting some cool, artsy shots of each other for our Instagram inside the building, if we could find a way inside. The place was definitely an old church. The shape of the windows confirmed it. We went to look through one of the windows, and it was way too dark to see inside. I told Carter to hand me a flashlight. The flashlight made all the difference. We could see inside now. We both noticed something strange in the pews. It was what looked like a person's head, hunched over, sitting down with their back to us. Carter said it looked like a mannequin, especially considering it was completely motionless. We placed a friendly bet. Carter betting it was a mannequin, and me betting it was some drunk homeless man. We went to the front door of the place and saw it was boarded up. Carter shook the door just for the hell of it to see if it would budge, but there was no shot. He implied this meant he won the bet because there was no way for a homeless person to get in there. I said, hold up, let's check the other windows for a closer view. So we walked along the other side of the church to the window we knew had the best angle of whatever we saw in there. But now, when I shined the flashlight through the glass, whatever was in that pew just a couple minutes ago was gone. I told Carter he owed me money because I was right, even though that was also terrifying. He asked, where did they go then? I shined the light in every direction until we both spotted it at the same exact time and jumped. The man standing right to the left of the window on the inside. He was looking at us. Didn't look like no homeless man to me though. We took off running back to the cornfield. We tried to find the bikes in a panic, but we couldn't. It was so dark out now that we were avoiding turning on our flashlights to expose ourselves. We heard a slam from the church building. It sounded like some kind of door. Carter told me to be quiet because he heard sounds in the cornfield, like the crops being brushed through by someone. Then it just stopped and went silent. Dead silent. No breeze at all, so all the crops were just still. We were stationary, ducked down, scared to move. We were in this position for a solid minute before Carter said in a low voice, "Which way did we leave the bikes?" And this was when we heard the crops mere feet away from us being brushed aside as someone was clearly running towards us. I screamed, "Go!"